The day I was asked to train my own replacement, I said yes. That's the part people find strange. Not the betrayal. They understand that. They've lived versions of it. What confuses them is that I agreed, quietly, without argument, and then I spent the next 6 weeks doing the most thorough knowledge transfer of my career. Every system documented. Every protocol written down in language even someone without a pharmaceutical background could follow. I was meticulous. I was professional. And then I quit. But that's not even the revenge part. That comes later. My name is Renata Solis. I'm 43 years old. For 14 years, I was the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Clinical Data Systems at Veridon Health Sciences, a mid-size pharmaceutical company headquartered in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. The kind of place where people park their Honda Civics next to leased BMWs and everyone pretends not to notice the difference. I want to be precise about what I built there, because this story only makes sense if you understand what I was worth to them. In 2012, when I joined Veridon as a mid-level regulatory analyst, the company was processing FDA submissions manually. Paper binders. Color-coded tabs. It was 2012. I'm not exaggerating. Within my first 18 months, I designed and implemented what we called the ARIS framework, the Automated Regulatory Intelligence System, a submission tracking and compliance dashboard that cut our average FDA response time from 74 days to 31. That system is still running. They just updated the interface in 2022 and kept my architecture underneath it because it works. By 2016, I had taken on clinical data oversight. We were running 11 concurrent trials across 3 therapeutic areas, and the data coordination between our CROs, our contract research organizations, was, to put it charitably, a mess. I built the Veridon ClinSync protocol from scratch. Reduced cross-site data discrepancies by 68%. We had a clean audit from the FDA that year. The first clean audit in 6 years. My manager at the time, Dr. Alicia Brennan, sent me a handwritten note. I still have it somewhere. In 2019, I led the regulatory response during a labeling crisis on our top revenue cardiovascular drug, Carvalen. I will not get into the details for legal reasons, but I will tell you that I worked 22 consecutive days without a single day off. I tracked every corrective action across 4 departments, coordinated with outside counsel, and prepared the complete response package for the FDA. We did not receive a warning letter. We did not face a consent decree. A competitor in a similar situation that same year was fined $47 million. I am not claiming sole credit, but I am not pretending I wasn't the person holding it together either. By the time everything fell apart, I was managing a team of 9, overseeing $34 million in active regulatory affairs budget, and had not taken a full weekend off, meaning no work communications, no system checks, nothing. In 3.5 years. I told myself that was dedication. I was wrong. It was just what they'd come to expect of me, which is a different thing entirely. I had 2 daughters in middle school. I had a mother in Chapel Hill with early-stage Parkinson's. I had a garden in my backyard that I started in 2018 and hadn't properly tended since 2019. These are not complaints. They are just the receipts. The new chief operating officer arrived in January of last year. His name was Bryce Calloway. He was 34. His LinkedIn said he had an MBA from a school I won't name because it would narrow things down too quickly. Before Veridon, he had spent 3 years at a medical device consultancy and, before that, 2 years at a consumer packaged goods company, the kind that makes protein bars and flavored sparkling water. He had never worked in pharmaceutical regulatory affairs. He had never worked at an FDA-regulated company. He had never, as far as I could determine, managed a team larger than 6 people. He was also the nephew of Veridon's chairman of the board, Douglas Calloway. I want to be fair. Nepotism hires exist on a spectrum. Some of them are simply people who got a door open for them and then walked through it competently. I have known a few of those. Bryce was not one of those. He arrived in January with a $220,000 salary, a relocation package that apparently included a downtown Raleigh apartment, and a confidence that I can only describe as architectural. The kind built on a foundation that has never been tested by load. The first time I met him was in a cross-functional leadership meeting on the 4th floor, in the room we called the atrium conference room because one wall was entirely glass and looked out onto the lobby atrium below. It sounds nicer than it was. The carpet was that particular shade of corporate gray that absorbs sound and ambition equally. He introduced himself to the group by saying he was excited to synergize our regulatory bandwidth with more agile go-to-market sequencing. I watched Dr. Brennan, who was now VP of Clinical Operations, write something in her notebook. I later found out she'd written the word "what" and underlined it 3 times. Over the following weeks, I came to understand Bryce's particular brand of incompetence. It wasn't laziness. He worked reasonably hard, I'll give him that. It was a complete absence of the ability to distinguish between important and unimportant information. He would spend 40 minutes in a meeting debating the formatting of a regulatory summary cover page and then wave away a question about adverse event reporting timelines because he had a hard stop. He mispronounced pharmacovigilance for 2 months, pharmacovigilance, emphasis on the wrong syllable, said with complete authority. And not one person corrected him because he was the COO and the chairman's nephew, and we all understood the geometry of the situation. He wore expensive suits that didn't quite fit through the shoulders. He smelled strongly of a cologne that I associated, irrationally but persistently, with the word aggressive. He had a habit of repeating back the last thing you said to him in a slightly different order, as if repackaging your idea in real time for his own use. Right, he'd say, leaning forward. So what you're saying is, we need to leverage the compliance architecture to de-risk the regulatory exposure. And you'd nod, because yes, that was approximately what you'd said, and also because you had 9 other things to do before 5 p.m. My first real warning sign came in March, when Bryce asked me to walk him through the ARIS framework one-on-one. I did. I spent 2 hours explaining the system I had designed, the logic behind its architecture, the way it interfaced with our document management system and our submission calendar. He nodded throughout. He asked 3 questions, none of which suggested he had understood anything I said. At the end, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as proprietary and said, "This is good. We're going to want to optimize this for more of a KPI-forward output orientation." I said, "What does that mean specifically?" He said, "We'll circle back." We never circled back. The meeting where they told me happened on a Tuesday in late April. Not a Monday. I've noticed people assume it was a Monday, because bad news feels like a Monday. It was a Tuesday, which is somehow worse. Tuesdays have no narrative dignity. I was called into a meeting with Bryce and our chief people officer, a woman named Sandra Fitch who had been at Veridon for 8 months and had the carefully neutral expression of someone who has attended too many of these meetings to bring anything personal to them anymore. The room was called Pierce Conference, named after a founder, small, no windows. 1 rectangular table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with an agenda no one had erased from the previous meeting that read, in blue marker, Q1 wins plus what's blocking US? I sat down. I noticed there was no water on the table. There is almost always water on the table. The absence of water felt like information. Bryce opened by saying they were reimagining the regulatory leadership structure to better align with Veridon's accelerated pipeline ambitions. Sandra slid a folder across the table. I didn't open it yet. "We're creating a new role," Bryce said. "Integrated Regulatory Strategy Executive. It's going to be bigger, more dynamic, more outward-facing." He paused. "And we've identified someone externally who we feel is the right fit for that evolution." I looked at him. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't shock. It was something closer to the feeling of a calculation completing a long equation finally resolving to the answer you'd suspected for months, but hadn't wanted to write down. "So my role is being eliminated," I said. "We're transitioning the function," he said. "And I'm not being considered for the new role." Sandra said, carefully, the decision was made to pursue an external search. I said, "Okay." Bryce seemed briefly disconcerted by the lack of drama. He had prepared, I think, for a different kind of meeting. He pressed forward. "We'd love for you to support the transition," he said. 60 days. Help onboard Marcus, get him up to speed on your systems, your team. We think your institutional knowledge is it's a real asset, Renata, and we want to capture that Before I leave, I said. Before the transition completes, he said. I looked at the folder. I opened it. There was a separation agreement, a transition timeline, and a section at the bottom about knowledge transfer deliverables. It was thorough. Someone had put real work into this document. Not Bryce, someone in legal, probably, or Sandra's team. That almost made it more impressive in a grim way. They had been planning this long enough to produce clean paperwork. Marcus, I said. What's his background? Bryce said Marcus had a robust commercial pharma background with strong leadership bandwidth and a real talent for operationalizing regulatory ecosystems. I said, what company? Bryce said the name of a company I recognized. A consumer health subsidiary. Mostly OTC vitamins and dermatology products. 510(k) clearances. No NDA experience. No FDA drug approval experience. No clinical trial oversight. I said, okay. Bryce said, so you're on board with the transition support? I said, I'll review the agreement with my attorney. That was the last thing I said in that room. I stood up, picked up the folder, and walked out. The whiteboard still said Q1 wins plus what's blocking US. As I passed it, I walked to the parking garage. I sat in my car for a while. The afternoon light came in at a flat angle through the concrete levels and made everything look overexposed. I didn't cry. I sat there for about 20 minutes and I thought, very clearly, about what I actually knew, what I had actually built, and what it would actually take for Veridon to run without me. The answer to that last question was the beginning of everything that followed. If any part of this resonates, if you've ever been asked to clean up your own crime scene on the way out the door, subscribe. I talk about workplace strategy and the mechanics of institutional power every week. Not anger, not venting, just the real analysis of how these systems work and how people like us can work them better. What Bryce didn't know was that I had started preparing for this 18 months before he arrived. That's not clairvoyance. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know Bryce specifically was coming. I didn't know what form the threat would take. What I had known quietly for several years, was that the company's appetite for what I provided was growing faster than their respect for the person providing it. There's a particular organizational moment I've learned to recognize, when leadership starts treating a system as infrastructure and the person who built it as overhead. It feels, when you're inside it, like a slow withdrawal of eye contact. Meetings you used to be included in. Emails where you used to be on the chain. Nothing dramatic. Just a gradual redefinition of what you are. I'd been watching that process at Veridon since roughly 2021. And in September of that year, 14 months before Bryce's first day, 19 months before the Tuesday in Pierce conference, I did something that, at the time, felt more like professional hygiene than strategic planning. I renegotiated my employment contract. Veridon was in the middle of a talent retention push. Half the industry was hemorrhaging people post-pandemic, and Veridon was no exception. They offered retention packages to senior directors. I accepted mine, and in the negotiation, I asked for 3 additions to my standard contract. My attorney, a woman named Caroline Park who had been doing employment law in Raleigh for 20 years and had a very good sense of humor about corporate self-deception, helped me phrase them carefully. The first addition was a knowledge transfer clause with a 90-day minimum notice requirement for any role elimination affecting systems I had designed or co-designed. They agreed. It seemed reasonable. It cost them nothing at the time, because at the time they had no plans to eliminate my role. The second addition was a consulting rights reservation. Specifically, any system I had architected during my employment that remained in active use within 12 months of my departure could be subject to consulting engagement at a rate to be negotiated, not arbitrarily, but based on documented market rates. Caroline called this one the tollbooth. It was not, to be clear, a guaranteed income stream. It was leverage. The distinction matters. The third addition was the one I thought most about. It was a proprietary methodology clause, and it covered the ClinSync protocol, specifically the cross-site clinical data coordination framework I had built from scratch in 2016. ClinSync wasn't just a workflow. It was documented, versioned, and in a separate IP annex I had added to the original 2016 development agreement. It included my name as primary architect alongside Veridon as owning entity. That annex had a clause, buried in Section 4B, that required my written consent for any modification to the core data validation logic. I had added that language in 2019 after the Carvalen crisis, when it became clear that ClinSync was the only reason our adverse event data had been clean enough to survive regulatory scrutiny. My manager at the time had signed off on the annex without fully reading it. I know this because the signing took 4 minutes and Section 4B is on page 11. I was not angry when I added these provisions. I was not anticipating a specific betrayal. I was simply doing what 14 years of watching institutional behavior had taught me to do: document everything, retain everything, and never assume that the people benefiting from your work have thought carefully about what happens when you're no longer there to do it. When I sat in my car in the parking garage on that Tuesday afternoon and thought about what it would take for Veridon to run without me, these 3 clauses were a significant part of the answer. The other part was Marcus Hale. Marcus started 2 days after my last official day at Veridon. I know this because Priya Okafor texted me. Priya was a senior regulatory analyst on my team, had been for 6 years. Methodical, precise, the kind of person who color codes her calendar not because she's anxious, but because she genuinely finds it useful. She had 2 children under 5 and operated with a level of focused efficiency that I had always quietly admired. She was also, as of the Tuesday in Pierce conference, one of 9 people who reported to a role that no longer existed. Her text said, "He's here." He asked me where the compliance portal was. I said we have 3. He said, "Yeah, the main one. I'm going to need a minute." I read it and set my phone face down on my kitchen counter and made coffee. I had been gone 4 business days. The compliance portal question told me everything I needed to know about the timeline that was coming. ARIS, my automated regulatory intelligence system, was not a portal. It was a framework with 4 integrated modules: submission tracking, adverse event logging, document version control, and FDA correspondence management. They did not have the same interface. They did not share a login. Understanding why required, at minimum, 2 weeks of hands-on orientation and a working knowledge of 21 CFR Part 11, which governs electronic records in FDA-regulated environments. Marcus Hale, whose most recent regulatory experience involved ensuring that a vitamin D supplement had the correct allergen disclosures on its label, did not have that working knowledge. Bryce called me on a Thursday, 10 days after my last day. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "Renata, hey, it's Bryce. Hope you're doing well. Listen, we're running into a few, integration challenges with the ARIS handoff and Marcus is getting up to speed, but there are some nuances to the architecture that the documentation doesn't fully capture. And we were hoping you might be open to a quick call, just 30 minutes, to help us get over this particular, inflection point in the transition. We'd really value your continued partnership on this. Anyway, yeah, call me back. Inflection point in the transition." I transcribed that into a notes document I had started keeping after the Tuesday meeting, which I had titled, with perhaps unnecessary precision, Veridon Post-Departure Record. I dated it. I noted the time. I did not call back. What Bryce did not know was that the ARIS documentation I had provided during the transition was complete, accurate, and genuinely thorough. I had not sabotaged it, had not omitted anything, had not introduced errors. I want to be unambiguous about this. What I had done was document the system faithfully, which meant that anyone reading it would understand, with absolute clarity, how complex it was. The documentation was not the problem. The problem was that understanding the documentation required a level of regulatory and technical background that Marcus did not have, that Bryce did not have, and that no one Veridon had retained on staff. Following 3 years of senior attrition, they had chosen not to address, currently possessed. I had not created this situation. I had simply declined to paper over it. By the end of the first week, the ARIS submission tracking module had produced its first real error. Not a catastrophic one. A sequencing error in the automated filing calendar, a 30-day submission window for a type 2 variation on one of their cardiovascular generics, had been flagged as closed when it was still open. Under normal circumstances, someone with regulatory affairs experience would have caught this in the daily Q review. Under current circumstances, no one caught it until Dr. Brennan noticed the discrepancy herself while cross-referencing a pipeline report. Dr. Brennan called me on a Friday evening. She didn't bother with preamble. "How bad is it?" she said. "The variation window?" "Yes. It's recoverable," I said. "But someone needs to manually reset the filing status in Module 2 before end-of-day Monday, or the system will archive the submission record and you'll have to reconstruct it from source documents. The override path is in the documentation. Section 7, pages 31 through 34. Silence. "Has Marcus looked at Section 7? I said. "Marcus," she said carefully, "is currently focused on stakeholder alignment." I said, "Okay." She said, "Renata." Just my name. The way she said it carried approximately 14 years of shared context. I said, "The documentation is complete, Alicia. Everything he needs is there." I paused. "I'd recommend he read it." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Are you doing all right?" I said I was. I was, actually. I had spent 3 days pulling weeds in my garden. My younger daughter had commented that I seemed less tired. My mother had visited and we had eaten dinner together on a Tuesday evening without me checking my phone once. These were not small things. The variation window error was resolved on Monday. I know because Priya texted me again. Her text said, "Alicia basically read Section 7 to him out loud." He took notes. Then, a minute later, he called it a workflow bandwidth issue. I did not respond. But I noted the date in my document. 2 weeks in, Veridon lost Paragon Scientific. Paragon was a mid-sized biotech based in Durham that had contracted Veridon for regulatory consulting support on 3 early-stage oncology compounds. The contract was worth $2.7 million annually and had been, for the 4 years of its existence, managed almost entirely through my team. Specifically through a relationship I had maintained with their VP of Regulatory Strategy, a man named David Chin, who had worked with me before at a previous company and had, when evaluating vendors years ago, chosen Veridon in part because I was there. David did not contact me when the relationship ended. He sent a formal termination notice to Sandra Fitch and copied Douglas Calloway on the email. I know the contents of this email because Priya forwarded it to me with a message that said only, "See attached." The relevant section of David's email read, in part, that Paragon had experienced a material decline in the quality and responsiveness of regulatory support since March of that year and had concerns regarding the technical expertise currently available within Veridon's regulatory affairs function. He was unfailingly professional. David always was. $2.7 million. Gone. In less than a month. Bryce called again the next morning. This time his voice had shed the corporate packaging entirely. He sounded like what he actually was, a 34-year-old who had made a serious mistake and was beginning to understand its dimensions. "Renata. Okay, look, I know we didn't. The transition could have been handled differently, and I want to own that, I do, and I think there's a real opportunity here to find a way forward that works for both, I mean. We're prepared to discuss bringing you back in some capacity, whether that's a consulting arrangement or even a return to a leadership role. We're flexible on the structure. We need your help. We have a Type A meeting request from FDA coming in and Marcus is," he stopped. Started again. "Marcus is working very hard, but the institutional knowledge piece it's significant, Renata. It's significant." He had finally understood the word. I said, "Have your attorney contact Caroline Park." He said, "Your attorney?" I said, "She'll explain the consulting rights provision." Silence. "There's a provision?" "In my contract," I said. Renegotiated September 2021. Section 4, Addendum C. The tollbooth. I may have called it that last part out loud. I'm not certain. I might have just thought it. Okay, he said. "Okay. I'll have legal reach out." I said, "Good." He said, "And Renata, the ClinSync modification we made last month. Marcus wanted to streamline the data validation logic, simplify it a bit. I said, stop. He stopped. Send me whatever was changed. Before you do anything else. Before I tell you what Bryce's attorneys found in Section 4, Addendum C, and what the ClinSync modification had actually broken inside the ARIS adverse event module, I want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered what the difference is between a person who gets taken advantage of and a person who doesn't? Most people assume it's luck or seniority or connections. It's not. It's documentation. It's understanding your own value precisely enough to protect it in writing before anyone asks you to. That's what I want to talk about in next week's video, the exact provisions worth adding to any employment contract in any industry before you need them. Subscribe so you don't miss it. It might be the most useful 40 minutes you spend this year. 3 weeks in, I received the ClinSync change log. It came as a PDF attachment in an email from Veridon's general counsel, a man named Peter Wills who I had worked with during the Carvalen crisis and who wrote emails the way careful people do when they suspect they're building a record. The subject line was, ClinSync architecture, requested materials. Professional. Neutral. The kind of language that contains no fingerprints. I opened the change log at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning with coffee and read it twice. What Marcus had done, in the name of streamlining the data validation logic, was remove 3 of the 6 cross-validation checkpoints from ClinSync's adverse event intake module. These checkpoints, which I had built in 2019, specifically in response to the Carvalen labeling crisis, were the system's internal error-catching layer. They cross-referenced incoming adverse event reports against 4 criteria: patient identifier consistency, event onset timing, reporter qualification, and drug batch traceability. The checkpoints existed to flag anomalies before they entered the main dataset. They were not decorative. They were not redundant. They were the mechanism by which the dataset maintained its integrity. Marcus had found them slow. He had described them, in his change request documentation, as duplicative quality gates creating throughput friction. I read that phrase 3 times. Throughput friction. He had removed them without a validation study. He had removed them without a 21 CFR Part 11 impact assessment. He had removed them, as far as I could determine, without telling anyone in quality assurance. And he had done this to a system that was currently receiving adverse event data from 2 ongoing Phase 3 clinical trials. I set down my coffee and called Caroline. How bad, she said. Potentially significant. Can you quantify it? Not yet. But Bryce's team has been operating a modified ClinSync for approximately 3 weeks, collecting adverse event data with 3 validation checkpoints missing. If there are any reporting anomalies in that dataset that the remaining checkpoints didn't catch, they'd have a data integrity problem, Caroline said. At minimum, I said. Depending on what's in the dataset, they could have a reportable deficiency under 21 CFR 312.32, which would mean they have an IND safety reporting obligation they don't know about yet. A pause. Renata, she said. I know. You need to document exactly when you found this. Timestamp the email. Don't forward it to anyone yet. I said, already done. The IND Safety Reporting Regulation, 21 CFR 312.32, for anyone who wants to look it up, requires sponsors and their agents to report any serious and unexpected adverse drug experience to the FDA within 15 days of becoming aware of it. The word aware carries significant legal weight in this context. If Veridon's modified ClinSync had failed to surface a qualifying event, and if that failure could be traced to Marcus's unauthorized modification, the question of when Veridon became aware and what they did with that awareness was a question with serious regulatory consequences. I had not created this problem. Marcus had created it on his 3rd week of employment. But I was, as of that Thursday morning, aware of it. And that awareness came with its own set of obligations. I called Dr. Brennan next. She answered on the first ring. Did you review the changelog? She said. She already knew I had it. Yes. How bad is it, Renata? Tell me clearly. You need to pull the adverse event dataset from the last 3 weeks. Both trials. Run a manual audit against the original 6 checkpoint validation criteria. If there are any events in that dataset that the modified system didn't flag, any SAEs that didn't generate a report, we have a 15-day window problem. Potentially. Silence. The specific kind of silence that comes when someone very competent is calculating the full dimensions of a situation. Does Peter Wills know? He sent me the change log, I said. So he knows about the modification. Whether he's connected the regulatory implications to the adverse event dataset is a different question. He hasn't, she said. He's been treating this as a contract dispute. It's not only a contract dispute. No, she said. It isn't. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I'm going to the board. I said, okay. She said, not because of you. Because I have an obligation to. I said, I know, Alicia. She said, I'll be in touch. She hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my garden through the window. The tomatoes I'd planted in April were doing well. One of the things I discovered in the 3 weeks since leaving Veradon was that I was very good at growing tomatoes. This had surprised me more than it probably should have. By week 5, Bryce threatened to sue me. The lawsuit threat arrived through Peter Wills in the form of a letter that Carvalen read to me over the phone with the measured cadence of someone reading a menu at a restaurant they find unimpressive. The core allegation was that I had interfered with business operations by declining to provide consulting support during a critical operational period, in breach of, and here the letter got creative, an implied duty of good faith arising from my extended tenure and senior position. Carvalen said, they're arguing that 14 years of loyalty created an obligation to keep working for free after they fired you. I said, that's what they're arguing. It's interesting, she said. Legally, it's nothing. But it's interesting. I said, send them Section 4, Addendum C, the knowledge transfer clause requiring 90 days notice, and the ClinSync IP annex. All of it. And ask them, specifically, whether they'd like to discuss the adverse event dataset issue in this forum or in a different one. Carvalen was quiet for a beat. You want to put that in writing? I want Peter Wills to put it in writing that he received it, I said. Yes. The threat of a lawsuit evaporated in roughly 72 hours. I know this because Carvalen received a call from Peter Wills' assistant saying Mr. Wills was requesting a confidential alignment conversation at their earliest mutual convenience. Carvalen scheduled it for the following Monday. She told me she would call afterward and that I should not, under any circumstances, contact anyone at Veradon in the meantime. I said I had no intention of doing so. In the 5 weeks since my departure, Veradon had lost $2.7 million in the Paragon Scientific contract, another $1.1 million when a smaller CRO named Lattice Bio quietly declined to renew its service agreement citing strategic fit, a phrase that David Chin had probably helped them choose, and was now facing the prospect of a potential IND safety reporting deficiency that, if it materialized into an FDA inquiry, would put every active trial under scrutiny. The total revenue exposure, by my rough calculation, was somewhere north of $11 million, factoring in pipeline delays on the 2 phase 3 compounds if the trials had to pause for a data integrity review. Bryce called me the night before the Monday meeting. I answered. I'm not certain why. Possibly curiosity. Possibly because I had finally run out of weeds to pull. He didn't use any jargon at all. That was the first thing I noticed. He said, Renata, I need to ask you something directly. I said, okay. Did you know this would happen? All of it. I thought about that for a moment. I knew the systems were complex, I said. I knew the documentation was thorough. I knew what experience was required to operate them correctly. That's not what I asked. No, I said. It isn't. A long pause. I made a mistake, he said. Not just about the transition. About everything. About what I understood. About what I didn't understand. About, he stopped. I'm not going to keep this position. I don't think I should. I told my uncle that this morning. I didn't say anything. I just want to know if the data is okay, he said. The patients in those trials. I want to know if anyone was hurt. That question, more than anything else he'd said across 5 weeks of calls, was the first thing Bryce Calloway had said that suggested he might, eventually, become the kind of person who could run something responsibly. I said, The preliminary audit showed no unreported SAEs in the dataset. The events that occurred during the 3-week modification window were within the remaining 3 checkpoints detection range. The patients are not in harm's way. He exhaled. The sound of it told me he hadn't slept much. I said, Bryce, have your team restore the original ClinSync validation logic before Monday's meeting. All 6 checkpoints. And file a voluntary disclosure with the FDA about the unauthorized modification. Don't wait for them to find it. Filing voluntarily is the difference between a Form 483 observation and a warning letter. Why are you telling me that? He said. Because I had spent 14 years in an industry where the patients at the end of the pipeline were real people. Because the systems I built existed to protect them, not to serve as leverage in a contract dispute. Because there is a significant difference between declining to paper over an institutional failure and being willing to watch it harm someone who had nothing to do with it. I didn't say any of that. I said, get some sleep. Monday's a long meeting. The following Monday, Caroline met with Peter Wills for 3 hours. I was not present. I was, at that point, in the middle of a second interview for the position that I will describe in a moment. I will tell you what Caroline told me afterward. She said the meeting covered 3 things: the consulting rights provision and the rate at which I would be compensated for any engagement with Veridon's ARIS and ClinSync systems going forward. The ClinSync IP annex and Veridon's formal acknowledgement that any further modification to the core validation logic required my written approval, and a mutual release agreement that satisfied the separation terms, added a meaningful severance supplement for the 90-day notice period they had failed to honor, and was signed by Peter Wills, Sandra Fitch, and Douglas Calloway himself. I asked what Douglas Calloway had said when he signed. Caroline said, he asked how long you had worked there. I said, what did Peter say? 14 years. What did Douglas say after that? Caroline paused. He said, oh, just that. Oh. The sound of 14 years arriving at someone all at once, the way large numbers sometimes do when they finally acquire context. Bryce Calloway submitted his resignation from the COO position 12 days after the Monday meeting, citing personal and professional reasons. The press release called it a mutual decision. Marcus Hale left 6 weeks after that. His LinkedIn currently lists him as a senior regulatory consultant at a firm I have not been able to identify, which suggests the firm may not yet have a LinkedIn presence, or may not exist in any form that generates much of a digital footprint. The voluntary FDA disclosure that Bryce filed, the one I told him to file, resulted in a Form 483 inspection observation, as I'd anticipated, rather than a warning letter. The observation was classified as a minor GMP deficiency. It was correctable. The trials continued. I know this because Dr. Brennan told me, in a message she sent 2 weeks after the Monday meeting, which said, both trials are proceeding. No reportable SAEs were missed. I wanted you to know. I said thank you. I meant it. 8 months later, I was the Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Data Integrity at a clinical stage biotech company called Meridian Therapeutic Sciences, headquartered in Durham. 7 miles from the Veridon offices I had occupied for 14 years. The commute was 17 minutes shorter. The parking was free. My new salary was $287,000, plus equity. The equity matters at a clinical stage company in ways I had not previously allowed myself to prioritize. I had spent 14 years optimizing for institutional loyalty. I was now at 43, learning to optimize for a different set of variables. David Chin had made the introduction. Specifically, he had sent an email to Meridian's CEO, a woman named Janet Lowe who had been in drug development for 25 years and had the quiet authority of someone who had been underestimated at least once and had chosen never to repeat the conditions that made it possible. The email said, in part, that I was the most operationally rigorous regulatory professional he had encountered in 15 years of pharmaceutical development. It was the most professionally useful thing anyone had ever said about me, and it had come from someone I had never asked for anything because I had never needed to ask. I had simply done the work well for years, consistently in his presence. He had noticed. That is, I think, the only real strategy. Be someone worth noticing. At Meridian, I built a new compliance architecture from scratch. I called it the ARIS system, Integrated Regulatory Intelligence Suite, because I am apparently incapable of not naming things, and because it amused me privately to know that ARIS was ARIS with one letter changed, and that the only person who would ever find that funny was me. The ARIS system handled submission tracking, adverse event management, and real-time CRO data coordination across 7 concurrent trials. I hired 4 people. 2 of them had worked for me at Veridon. Priya Okafor was one of them. She had left Veridon 3 months after I did. Her exit interview, she told me, had taken 11 minutes. She accepted her offer from Meridian on a Friday afternoon and texted me, "I'm in. Also, I have 47 comments for your new documentation framework." I replied, "Send them." She sent 51. I incorporated 38 of them. The other hire I want to mention was a junior analyst named Tomas Reyes, 26 years old, 2 years out of a regulatory science graduate program at UNC, who had applied to Meridian after reading a LinkedIn post I had written about documentation practices in clinical trial environments. He was careful, precise, and had an instinct for spotting process gaps that reminded me of myself at that age, before the industry had taught me to be quieter about what I noticed. I was working, actively, not to teach him that lesson. 6 months after I joined Meridian, Veridon had stabilized under a new COO, a woman named Dr. Rosa Ellerby, who came from a large-cap pharma background and who, by all available reports, actually knew what pharmacovigilance meant and how to pronounce it. They had retained their remaining CRO relationships. They had passed a routine FDA inspection in the fall. I have no particular feelings about any of this. They had made choices with real consequences, and then they had made different choices, and the industry had continued without interruption, as industries generally do. Douglas Calloway remained chairman of the board. I expect he will for some time. The architecture of institutional power rarely renovates itself dramatically. What changes is who knows how to work within it, and who doesn't, and what that knowledge is worth when the moment arrives to name a price. I know what I'm worth now. I should have known it 14 years earlier. That gap between what you're worth and what you've consented to accept is where most of the damage in a career gets done. My garden, by the way, is doing extremely well. I had more tomatoes last summer than any reasonable household of 4 could consume. I gave most of them to neighbors, including a retired couple next door who left a bottle of wine on my porch with a note that said these are the best tomatoes we've ever had. I put the note on my refrigerator. It sits there now next to Dr. Brennan's handwritten note from 2016, the one she sent after the clean FDA audit. They seem to belong together, somehow. Both of them records of something done well. Both of them written by hand, because the things that actually matter tend to get said that way. What I want to leave you with isn't a lesson about revenge. I don't think what I did was revenge, exactly. Revenge implies you're still in relationship with the person who hurt you, still trying to balance a scale. I was never trying to balance anything. I was trying to make sure that what I had built was recognized for what it was, mine. Not mine to hoard, not mine to withhold forever, but mine to name accurately, protect contractually, and exit on my own terms. The difference between the person who gets exploited and the person who doesn't is rarely talent. It's rarely intelligence. It's whether you were told, or whether you told yourself, early enough, that your work has specific, documentable value, and that you are allowed to say so before someone else decides it for you. The instinct to be quiet about what you're worth, to be modest, to not make it transactional, that instinct was trained into me, and I suspect it was trained into a lot of you watching this. It reads as professionalism. It reads as grace. And it is, partly. But it also costs you, in ways that don't always show up immediately, and when they do show up, they show up all at once, in a small conference room with no water on the table and a whiteboard that still says Q1 wins. Know your value before someone else decides to stop acknowledging it. Write it down. Sign it. Date it. Keep a copy somewhere they don't control. That's not cynicism. That's documentation. And documentation, more than anything I have ever built, is what kept me whole. If any of this reflects something you've lived, or something you're living right now, the slow withdrawal of credit, the feeling of being treated as infrastructure rather than a person. I hope this was useful. Like and subscribe if it was. I share workplace strategy, contract analysis, and honest thinking about how professional power actually works every week. And remember, the most dangerous thing you can do in a workplace that's decided to devalue you is to keep doing excellent work without protecting what you've made. Document the work. Name the systems. Add the clauses. And know precisely, specifically, in writing, what you cost to replace.